Well, I'm going to go ahead and get into my message because I have a lot of information that I want to convey, and I decided that I was going to do an overview of world history, and I wanted to study what the most common form of government was in world history. So I went back to the beginning of the invention of writing, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. And they were invented around 3,000 or 4,000 BC. And we're around 2080, so 3 and 2, that's around 5,000 or 6,000 years of history, and which is not that long. 6,000 years is just 60 people living 100 years each. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. It's not that long ago. So, Egyptian, Sumerian cuneiform, 3300 BC. Here's Neil deGrasse Tyson, an astrophysicist, Cosmos TV series. He said, it was here around 5,000 years ago between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we learned how to write. So, we have these records. Let's look at them. What do they show? They show there's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. And so, the first story we have is Nimrod, Tower of Babel. Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said Nimrod wanted to build the tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. So it sort of had this defiant, in-your-face attitude. God comes down, confuses the languages, and the people what? Scatter. So we see this first illustration of power concentrated, defiant against God, and power separated into the hands of the people. Everybody hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power. Concentrated power. Fingers apart with the other. Say separated power, separated power. Now back to the fist, concentrated power. That is world history. For most of world history, power is concentrated in the hands of the kings and pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and sultans and czars. Very rarely do people get a chance to scatter and separate the power into the hands of the people. But in times of crises, the rubber band snaps back. So it's almost like every generation tries to rebuild the Tower of Babel, only on a bigger scale each time it comes around, because with military advancements, you can kill more people. So, have you ever seen The Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger? There's this killer metal robot from the future, and they blow it up, and everybody sighs relief. But then the little metal pieces melt into silvery droplets, and they roll together into a silvery pool, sort of like mercury, and out of it comes the hand of this Terminator, starts chasing him again. It's like, how do you get rid of this thing? Now, so God scattered it at the Tower of Babel, but every generation keeps trying to rebuild this Tower of Babel. And now I decided to plot out these empires to see how they would get bigger and bigger. And have you ever seen a seashell that does a little circle, a little bigger circle, a little bigger circle? Is it showing on the screen? Okay. It's a rate of geometric expansion called the golden ratio or phi or the Fibonacci sequence. And you see it in tornadoes and hurricanes and galaxies. And I decided to plot it out with the kingdoms. And so you have Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and then you have Gilgamesh, king of Uruk or Iraq. And he is around 2500 BC. And you know what his big invention was? He came up with the idea of building a wall around his city. What a novel idea, a wall. And so Gilgamesh goes on this long journey to meet this old guy who survived the global flood. It's the story of Noah. This old guy had built a boat, covered it with tar and pitch, filled it full of animals. The world flooded and afterwards repopulated it from everyone that came out of the ark. And over 100 ancient civilizations have flood stories and flood legends in their ancient past. Gee, maybe there was a flood. And then around 2250 BC, Sargon of Akkadian conquers a bunch of walled cities from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And then you have 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, and they control the people, the cattle, the land. And then there's 5,000 years of Chinese emperors. And then around 700 BC, Assyria is the biggest empire on the planet with their capital of Nineveh. And you know the story of Jonah, and they took the 10 northern tribes of Israel captive. But Assyria was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, which was conquered by Persia. And so Cyrus of Persia has the biggest empire, but his empire is conquered by Alexander the Great, and he has the biggest empire, but he stopped from going into India by Chandragupta, and he controls all of India, a quarter of the world's population. And then around 25 BC, Augustus Caesar has the biggest empire. He even wanted to have a worldwide census. It was his is his global tracking system. Right? It was like NSA, Patriot Act, the Chinese social credit system wanting to track everybody. Something about dictators that want to track everybody. And then 400 AD, Attila the Hun has the biggest empire. 500,000 soldiers wiping out cities across Europe. And then you have the Byzantine Empire with Justinian. And then Islam comes along. And they conquer from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean, killing millions. And Islam enslaved an estimated 180 million Africans. Muhammad was a white Arab. But then the Muslims are stopped from going into Europe by Charles Martel's, the grandfather of Charlemagne. And so they stop him at the Battle of Tours. But then you got Genghis Khan in the 1200s. He has the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. He conquers from Korea to Russia to Hungary, kills 30 million people. His grandson is Kublai Khan that runs all of China. And then Tamerlane in the 1300s. He kills another 17 million across Central Asia. And then Ivan the Terrible in the 1400s. All right, he kills 60,000 in Novgorod, and he has this biggest empire, 12 time zones as big as Russia. And then you cross the ocean, Aztec Montezuma. And they're capturing people and ripping their hearts out to the sun god. And then you have the Atahualpa, who's the head of Inca Peru. And every single person is an employee of the state. It's totally centralized. And then the 1500s, the King of Spain has the biggest empire. The sun never set on it. The Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. And then the late early 1700s, France has the biggest empire. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. And then in the late early 1800s, England becomes the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. 13 million square miles and 500 million people. All of India, a quarter of the world's population right there. Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, and America. He was like a one world government guy, like a globalist with him at the top. And so why does this power want to keep concentrating? Why does each generation want to rebuild the Tower of Babel? The problem is it's in each of our fallen human DNA. And so you got the fall in the garden, Cain killing Abel. St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one takes the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground, one is the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some natives in the woods, one of them is the Indian chief, and you put them in an inner city, one of them is the gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader. It's a hierarchical system. If you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you are an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. And so it's this pyramid structure to society that keeps repeating itself all around the world. You got the dictator Pharaoh at the top. You got the government officials that are kissing up to him and carrying out his will, the soldiers to enforce it, and then down at the bottom are the slaves. Now, what if you were the king? Pretty nice. And then you have a sister that you really love. And she has a son. Now he's a teenager. He's hanging around the wrong kids. He's partying and drinking, and he's driving the car and hits someone and kills him. And now this teenager is facing manslaughter charges, mandatory prison time. And your sister comes begging to you. And she says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get locked away. What are you going to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if you're family or friends with the king, you get special treatment. You're not family and friends, you don't get that. And if someone wants to point out your favoritism, you will be tempted to want to shut them up. And so it just happens. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what's the answer? Scatter the power, separate it. And now this desire for power to concentrate, it just happens because of fallen nature. It's a pull of a magnet. It's the law of gravity. You have good people want to concentrate power so they can do good, but then it ends up being inherited by their kids and grandkids who are rotten. So the first invention ever was the plow. Cain was a tiller of the soil. And then people started hitting each other with them, and they turned into weapons. And then people gravitate together for protection. You get people together. Someone's a little better at knowing how to fight than the rest, and you say, you be our captain. And so he organizes you, and you fight, you win. That's a good thing. But then he has kids and grandkids who claim to be an elite class. a special family. Everybody wants to butter up to this family, and before you know it, you got this political family, this political boss, this mob boss, a gang leader. You got a tyrant, you got a king. So it just happens. Power wants to concentrate. And so you might even have a good king. Remember, Joseph was good, and he helped concentrate power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what did the Pharaoh do with all this concentrated power? He took care of the children of Israel, gave them the best land of Goshen, gave them food, even gave them jobs to take care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and he used all this concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, wanting to throw their kids in the river and so forth. And so what happens is you always have a good parties in power, and they're like, hey, let's concentrate. Let's start a Department of Justice and a Department of Education, a Department of this and that, and we can do good with it. Yeah, it's almost like the devil sits back for a couple of years and says, do whatever you want, because I'm going to inherit it sooner or later. And I'm going to use that Department of Education to push Common Core, transgender. I'm going to do all this stuff, right? So the danger is the concentration of power. And know the movie, The Lord of the Rings? Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And so that same fallen nature, Cain, kill, and Abel, Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and the Pharaoh, Caesars, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsars, it has a global goal in mind that's going to be played out in the last book of the Bible. The only difference is the military and technological advancements allow you to kill more people and to track and control more people. Right? And so instead of Cain, kill, and Abel with a rock, now you're using a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a phalanx spear that the Greeks had or a scimitar sword or a composite bow or gunpowder or nuclear power. Now, these kings claim to be divinely appointed. It's called the divine right of kings. The Creator gives all the power to the king, and he dispenses it to these lowly people. And here's the King of France, King Louis XIV, the Sun King. He said, I am the state. And one time, his administrator said, King, I'm sorry, you can't do this particular thing because it's illegal. And he said, it is legal because I wish it. Oh, well, that's easy. The law is nothing more than the king's wishes. And he just happens to have a really powerful army to make you obey. Here's King James. Jamestown is named after him. He says, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth, sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, master over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. Can you begin to see why the founders wanted to break away from a king? And so this is the British Empire at its greatest extent. It was a one-world government, right? I think there's only 22 countries that were never invaded or controlled by Britain. It took centuries, millennia, for America's founders to break away from a globalist king. James Wilson was a signer of the Declaration. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they should live. So he says 6,000 years and something unique happened in America. Here's Daniel Webster, Secretary of State. He said, miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. So he's using the number 6,000 and something unique happened here. Now, why would everybody be upset if our Constitution fails? Because for 6,000 years, these people that are under oppressive tyrants and pharaohs and sultans, they think, man, if only we could break away and we could live our lives the way we want without some dictator government telling us what to do. Wouldn't that be great? And if America did it and we blow it, there's going to be no hope for the rest of humanity. Anyway, now how did America's form of government come about? Am I keeping your attention okay? So let's jump into history. The 1500s, the two most powerful kings on the planet is the King of Spain and the Muslim Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. And he controls this huge area that all used to be Christian, right? North Africa used to be Christian. There were 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. Egypt used to be Christian. It was evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then the Muslims conquered it. Syria was completely Christian, evangelized by Paul. The name Syria, the name Christian was first used in Syria. There's more ancient Christian writing in the Syrian language of Syriac than any other language other than Greek and Latin. You want to study ancient Christian writings, you're going to read Greek and Latin and Syriac. And these Syrian Christians evangelized east like the Greeks did west. And they evangelized into India, Mongolia, even China. In the 600s, during the Tang dynasty in China, they uncovered these big stone monuments that have Chinese writing and Syrian writing. And so what happened, Syria was extremely a powerhouse of Christianity until it was conquered by Caliph Umar. And then the Turks converted to Islam and they conquered Turkey. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by Muslim Turks. Right? All the letters in the New Testament to Ephesus and Colossae and Galatia and Philippi and Corinth, all those cities wiped out by the Muslim Turks. The Greek Christians begged the West for help. The West sent help. It's called Crusades. When they fizzle, the Muslims conquer Constantinople, cutting off the land routes to India. That's when Columbus looks for a sea route. And then finally, the Muslims are at the gates of Vienna. And there they are. It's the year 1529. And so, Martin Luther starts the Reformation a few years earlier, 1517. And Charles V of Spain is faced with a double problem. The Muslim invasion on one hand, surrounding Vienna, this Reformation on the other hand. And so he tries to stop the invasion on his own and can't. And he finally realizes he needs the Protestants' help. And so he does a peace treaty with the Protestants called the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. And it's a pretty significant treaty because it's the first treaty ever to recognize Protestants. And there's a little Latin phrase in the treaty, cuius regio ius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims who are invading Europe because they sort of want to kill us all. And so it's one Christian denomination per country in Europe now. Prior to that, it was Catholic, but now you get to decide. And whatever the king believed, his kingdom had to believe. And if you didn't believe the way your king did, it was considered treason, you were persecuted, and you fled. So suddenly, Europe went from Catholic being invaded by Muslims. Now every kingdom has its own denomination, and if you don't believe the way the king did, you're fleeing. So all these religious wars are breaking out, mass migrations. So England. King Henry is the king, and his advisors tell him, if you're serious about breaking with Rome, you got to get rid of that Latin Bible. Martin Luther got rid of the Latin Bible. He came up with a German Bible. That helped the German princes to break away from Rome. You need an English Bible. And so he has the English Bible translated, basically takes William Tyndale's work and redoes it. And people start reading it. And something unexpected happened. People begin to compare what the king is doing to the Bible. And they want to purify the Church of England. And so they're nicknamed Puritans. The king doesn't think he needs purifying, so he persecutes them. Another group said it's beyond hope of purifying. We're going to separate ourselves. We're going to meet in barns and basements, and they would get arrested. And so the king said, yeah, you can read the Bible in your own language, but no, you can't believe whatever you want. You still have to believe what I tell you to. And so he passes the Act of Uniformity of Prayer. You want to say a prayer? You don't make up prayers. You read the approved prayers for weddings, funerals, baptisms, whatever. And if you have 5 people meeting in your home without approval of the government, you're all criminals. They'll bust in and arrest you. If you're caught preaching within 5 miles of a town, you've broken the 5 Mile Act. And they will, if you don't have approval of the government, and they drag you before the Star Chamber. Has stars on the ceiling. And they would twist your arm and cut off your ear and brand you on the face as a heretic, or lock you in the Newgate prison until you starved to death because they wouldn't feed you. It was because of this that the Pilgrims fled England and fled to Holland. And they're there for 12 years until Spain threatens to attack. They want to flee again. And so they say, well, let's just go to Jamestown. We'll be so far away from England that we can sort of do our little pilgrim stuff and nobody will notice. And they start coming across, but they get caught in a storm, and they try, the main beam breaks that's holding up the mast, and they finally get to the shores of America, and they're 500 miles away from Jamestown. And you think, no big deal, just sail down the coast. Well, it's winter, it's stormy. And off the coast of Cape Cod, it's really shallow. 3,000 ships have sunk there on the sandbars that go way out miles into the ocean. The Pilgrims almost sink. And the captain says, too dangerous. He goes back to Plymouth Rock, and he says, everyone off the boat. And the Pilgrims say, well, we got to question who is going to be in charge of us. We were going to go to Jamestown and submit to the king's government. The whole world's ruled by kings and all their little underlings. And there's no king-appointed person among us. Who's going to be in charge? they do something unique. They give themselves the authority to start a government. It's called the Mayflower Compact. It's we, in ye presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic, to enact just and equal laws, as shall be thought most meet or necessary, unto which we promise all due submission. Simple, revolutionary. In the womb of this little Mayflower was a DNA change. It was a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top-down rule by a king, it's bottom-up rule by the people. And since they were 3,000 miles away, and Europe was the chessboard that all the kings were fighting over, America was sort of like this afterthought. And so this was significant in world history. It's the difference between a dead pyramid and a living tree, where every root and every little capillary root sucks in nutrients to help keep the tree alive. Every citizen needs to participate to make this bottom-up thing live. Again, difference between divine right of kings to we the people. Where did the Pilgrims get this idea? From their pastor, John Robinson. He's considered one of the founders of the Congregationalist denomination. It's this church model where everybody in the congregation is involved in the ministry, and you're faithful in the very little, right? Taking care of the nursery and the, junior high Sunday school. Then you eventually, he that's faithful in the very little, you become a deacon, and you move up the ladder, and then you get into the ministry yourself. And then they simply took their church model of government and made it their community model of government. Matter of fact, they even had the community government meetings in the church. And so this painting hangs in our U.S. Capitol. Now, it's interesting. The reformers, when the Muslims were invading Greece, Greek scholars are fleeing to Europe and bringing their Greek stuff. We call it the Renaissance. But they also bring their Greek New Testaments. And so for the first time, European scholars can read the Bible in Greek. And they notice words they hadn't seen before, and one of them was ecclesia. Ek means out of, ecclesia means a calling, and it's a Greek word, means a calling out of the people from their homes into a public place for the purpose of deliberating. And Jesus chose that word to say, upon this rock I'll build my ecclesia, called out assembly of the people. He's talking about his body. Everybody's involved in this thing. And King James didn't like that. The first Bible that was significant in England was William Tyndale's Bible. He does not have the word church anywhere in there. Every place the word ecclesia is translated congregation or assembly. Well, King James didn't like that. And so he gave instructions to the translators saying, I want you to, keep it, and this is what he said, the old ecclesiastical words to be kept as the word church, not to be translated congregation. Now, why would he want that? Because he was the head of the Anglican Church. He wanted a top-down form of church government. He didn't want the people being involved in the ministry. He wanted to maintain the clergy-laity division. And so what happened to the non-conforming pastors? They fled. They fled England to Holland. They fled Holland to America. And then once they got here, the Puritans decided to come over. They didn't like the king telling them what to do in England. But once the Puritans got to America, they said, well, you know what? Maybe it's not such a bad thing that the government tell the church how to have church, because we're in charge of the government. There's so many Puritans in Massachusetts, we can pretty well dictate. And so the non-conforming pastors had to flee again. And they founded new communities in New England. And you had a Reverend John Lothrop and his church founded Barnstable, Massachusetts. A Reverend Roger Williams and his church founded Providence, Rhode Island, and the First Baptist Church in America. Reverend John Wheelwright and his church founded Exeter, New Hampshire, and Reverend Thomas Hooker and his church founded Hartford, Connecticut. This was unique on planet Earth, this little greenhouse of New England that was an afterthought. Everybody's fighting over Europe and the Middle East and so forth. And here, these little pastors and their churches are founding communities. And for 50 years before Europe's Age of Enlightenment, you have Reverend Thomas Hooker and his church flee. The Puritans said only Puritans could vote in elections. Thomas Hooker said, no, anyone that's a Christian should be allowed to vote in elections. That was a big enough deal for Thomas Hooker to say, church, next Saturday, meet in the parking lot with your wagons, we're leaving. And they went hill and dale, and they founded Hartford. Well, after they're in Hartford, the church members come to their pastor and say, Pastor, can you do a sermon on how we're supposed to set up our government? And so he gives a sermon in 1638 titled, The Foundation of Authority is Laid Firstly in the Free Consent of the People. This is reflected in our declaration, government from the consent of the governed. This is revolutionary again, because the foundation for authority in Europe was the creator giving the power to the king, and he's God's lieutenant, and he dispenses it to these lowly subjects. No, in New England, he says it's a flip. And he goes on in his sermon, the privilege of election belongs to the people. This is reflected in our Constitution, we the people. He says they who have the power to appoint officers and magistrates, it is in their power to set the bounds and limitations of the power. His sermon is written down. It's called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It's used as the government of Connecticut from 1639 up until 1818. Connecticut uses Reverend Thomas Hooker's sermon as their constitution. Becomes a blueprint for the other New England colonies and eventually the U.S. Constitution. That's why Connecticut's called the Constitution State. Have it on their license plate and their so forth. Is this interesting? Now, here's a plaque in England. It says, Thomas Hooker's, was the founder of the state of Connecticut, and he's the father of American democracy. Here's this guy you never heard of, and over there they think he's the father of American democracy. Here's another plaque in England. Thomas Hooker, Puritan clergyman, reputed father of American democracy. Here's a statue of Thomas Hooker in Hartford, Connecticut, holding a Bible. At the bottom of it says, leading his people through the wilderness. He founded Hartford. On this site, he preached the sermon, which inspired the fundamental orders. It was the first written constitution that created a government. Here's another plaque in Hartford. It says, Thomas Hooker preached his famous sermon, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people, and then the people send representatives to adopt the fundamental orders. What do the fundamental orders say? The people conjoin ourselves to be as one public state or commonwealth. Sounds like the Mayflower Compact. We covenant ourselves together to form a civil body politic. Why? To preserve the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus. So in other words, the most important thing was the gospel, and this particular form of government was the best way to preserve the freedom of the gospel. Here's another plaque in Hartford. They have lots of plaques in Hartford. It says, Thomas Hooker's congregation established the form of government upon which the present Constitution of the United States is modeled. Do you grasp the significance of this? His church model, we covenant together, becomes the Constitution model. We, right, set up we the people. It's a bottom-up form of government. It's not a top-down one. So in New England, instead of separation of church and state, it's the pastors and their churches that created the state. How could you say, pastor, don't get involved in politics when all there was in Hartford was the pastor? Right? How could you say church members don't get involved in politics when all there was in Hartford was the church members? Calvin Coolidge says the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man. In order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. So these colonies in New England, they had a question. They did an experiment. They realized that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. They came from Europe where kings were burning people at the stake for not believing, and they saw in the scriptures that Jesus never burnt anybody at the stake. And so if Jesus never forced anybody to follow him, we can't. Right? One time, Jesus multiplied loaves and fishes. A bunch of people are following him for a free lunch, maybe even wanting to make him king, and he's like, it's almost like he says something difficult on purpose. He knew that they would have trouble understanding it, and it's almost like he did it on purpose to shake away those that were following him for the wrong reasons. The only ones left were the ones that said, Jesus, I don't understand it all, but I'm following you because of faith, right? And Jesus even turns to Peter, says, you want to go too? And Peter says, where else can I go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. And so if Jesus didn't run after him with a sword and say, get back here or I'll chop your head off, if he didn't do it, we can't. So if the kingdom of God, the values of the kingdom cannot be forced from the top down, how is it going to happen? These pastors in New England thought if the majority of the people held godly values, and elected representatives with their values. Then laws would be passed reflecting the values, and the values of the kingdom could come voluntarily percolating from the bottom up, not forcibly shoved from the top down. Right? It says in Psalms, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. Anyway, so this is the change. In New England, instead of from the creator to this one special guy, the king, to the people, no, we sort of leave out the king. And we say the creator gives the rights to each individual person. We're all equal, and we choose from amongst equals who's going to fix the potholes in the road, who's going to defend against the Indians, right? And so now kings always want to insert themselves between you and God. Remember Nebuchadnezzar said, when I have my trumpets blown, you bow to my statue. I don't care if you have a warm feeling in your heart for my statue. You bow or I'm going to throw you in the fire. Right? Kings want to say, look, even though marriage between a man and a woman has been around for 6,000 years, I decide that you have to adopt a gay marriage and all this transgender stuff. If not, I'll send my Department of Justice in and sue your little communities. This was being enforced in America, and unfortunately, it's still going on in the public school system. And so kings always want to dictate to you your beliefs. They want you to give up your deeply held religious convictions, right? Your guns and your Bibles, the different rhetoric. So Calvin Coolidge said, placing every man on a plane where he acknowledged no superiors, he must inevitably choose his own rulers through a system of self-government. So now we're getting into some interesting stuff. Where did these pastors in New England get the idea that people could choose their own leaders? Oh, they got a little bit from England, Magna Carta tying the king's hands. They got a little from the Roman Republic until Julius Caesar found a way to usurp power and make himself dictator. They did get some ideas from Athens until Alexander the Great's dad found out he could bribe citizens of Athens to betray their own city. But ultimately, the founders got their idea from ancient Israel. You think ancient Israel influenced the founding of America? Yeah, they taught Hebrew at Harvard and Yale. And I was reading the ratification of the Constitution. So the U.S. Constitution was written, but before it could go into effect, it needed to be ratified by 9 states. They had 8, and New Hampshire was in line to be the 9th. But it was having a deadlock. They were going to vote against it. And Harvard President Samuel Langdon shows up, and he gives an address to the delegates titled, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." Instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we may substitute the 13 states of the American Union and see this application plainly. After his address, they vote, they ratify it. They're the 9th state to do so, and the U.S. Constitution goes into effect. Our U.S. Constitution went into effect after the sermon, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." So, what was the Republic of the Israelites? Well, around 1400 BC, Israel comes out of Egypt, and for 400 years, they do not have a king. This is the first instance in all of recorded history of a nation with millions of people and no king. And the law says everyone's equal. It's not, oh, if you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. No, Israel, the law says every person, male and female, is made in the image of the Creator. And this Creator says there's no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone is to be treated the same. No matter what race, what color, what sex, everybody's to be treated the same. It's the beginning of the concept of equality. That everyone you see is equal to you. There's no royal family somewhere that everyone wants to butter up next to. Israel had an idea of tolerance. Here they were worshiping the one true God, and they never felt compelled to force anyone to worship him. You get your lamb and you drag it to the temple. No. Israel was the first nation with private land ownership. You see, wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It's always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross the king, he will take away the land and kill you. In Israel, the land was permanently titled to each family. If they got in a pinch and sold it every 50 years, the land reverted back to that family. This prevented a dictator from gathering up all the land, passing it on to his kids, and getting back to a dictator that controls everybody, because each family had permanent title to the land. And it's called the Promised Land because you got to own it. If you own land, You can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. You got stuff, you worked hard, you saved it. Israel had no police. Everyone was taught the law. Everyone helped enforce the law. It was like everybody was deputized. We have a little of that today with traffic laws. Somebody's weaving in and out of the lanes, cut you off, you take it upon yourself to honk the horn, right, and enforce it. Or maybe a mom watching some neighborhood kids. She has no problem correcting somebody else's kid. In Israel, everybody corrected everybody else. It was a self-policing system. Israel had no standing army. You have a king, he has an army to enforce his will. In Israel, every man was in the militia and armed with a sword upon their thigh, and they were ready at a moment's notice to defend their family and their community. Israel had no prisons. Remember, in Egypt, Joseph was in prison for 3 years, right? In Israel, when a crime was committed, you immediately got the elders of the city together and the accused, and you had the trial right then. And then, of course, there was a city of refuge that somebody could run away to await the trial. But it was immediate. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. What's that? Remember in Egypt, people were selling their souls to the Pharaoh for a bag of grain? In Israel, when people harvested their field, they left the corners, the gleanings, for the poor people to pick through, like Ruth. This way, the poor were taken care of without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out selectively to those who can help them stay in power, right, as favors. Israel had a system of honesty. God hates unjust weights and measures. This became the basis for commerce. You could trust people. And Israel got to choose their own leaders. Remember, Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I myself alone bear your burden? Take you wise men and understanding and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. This was an election process within the tribe, right? Who do we know that's honest and that hate covetousness and so forth? And we shove them forward. Here, Moses, here's our guy. So in Israel, anyone could be raised up into leadership. Gideon from a nobody family. Here's Deborah, a woman. She's not related to royalty. It's just her. She knows the law. She's honest. The reputation spreads. She sits under a tree. People come from all across the country for her to hear their case and tell her what the law says as a judge. Where else in the world could a woman become a national leader who's not related to a king or a pharaoh? So Harvard President Samuel Langdon says, the Israelites may be considered as a pattern to the world in all ages of government on Republican principles. From abject slavery, a mere mob, to a well-regulated nation under laws far superior to what any other nation could boast. Think of it. They go from 400 years of slaves, they can't even read, and suddenly they get downloaded the most unique form of government the planet has seen. And it works. It's not like Athens where they do a little trial and error. Israel was the first nation that could read. So, Sumerian cuneiform, we started talking about that. There were 1,200 cuneiform characters. Very complicated, and only for the kings and scribes. Common people didn't read them. In Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters. Only 1% of Egypt could read. Reading and writing was the scribes' secret knowledge. They actually kept the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. They were needed to interpret them. China had 10,000 characters. It was the communication of the deep state ruling class. Only the upper class could read. The common people weren't allowed to. And we had a little of that in America prior to the Civil War, where some of the southern states actually had laws making it a crime to teach slaves to read. Frederick Douglass, the Republican advisor to Lincoln, writes in his autobiography about being a little boy, and the slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet. Her husband walks in, yells at her, and says, don't you dare teach slaves to read. They'll grow discontent, run away, forge documents, and later he's in the house. And they see him looking at a newspaper, sounding out the letters. They snatch the newspaper away, and they chase him out of the house. And Frederick Douglass said, that was the first sermon that convinced me that I wanted to learn how to read. You want to control people, you want to keep them ignorant. Maybe pass them through a Common Core type system where they go through behavior modification, but not academic achievement, right? And so anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss said ancient writing's main function was to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. So when Moses comes down the mountain, he does not just have the law, he has the law in a 22-character alphabet. First letter's Aleph, second letter Beth. Sound familiar? Israel is the first nation where everyone could read. And so the priests taught the law. They also taught every single person how to read the law. And the families were supposed to teach their kids how to read. And so here's a Greek philosopher, Eupolemos, in 158 BC. Moses was the first wise man that he taught the alphabet to the Jews, who passed it on to the Phoenicians, who passed it on to the Greeks. Harry S. Truman said the fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the mount. So if you think of power, we're talking power, you think of power as a line, as a spectrum. One side is total government, the other side is no government. Remember we did that at the beginning? Total government, you get a king, he rules through fear, you do what he says or he kills you. The no government side would be anarchy, no government, unless each person is taught the law. It's like everybody downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. Instead of a GPS telling you where to turn, it tells you how to act. Right? Be nice to this person. It's in real time. Right? Don't steal that. And the Levites are the computer geeks that help you to download the app. Right? Go to the App Store here, press this button here, now go to this, go to line upon line, precept upon precept. So everybody downloads their own copy of this app. They got this internal law that was taught to them by the Levite priests. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Israel has the key ingredient. There is a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal. Nobody's around. There's no police. You know you can get away with it. And then you remember, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country really, truly believes that they're personally accountable to God for this, you can maintain complete order and safety with no police. Maximum liberty. Right? Now, it only works with the God of the Bible. An Islamic Allah God says, there's an infidel woman there, that nobody's around, you can rape her, it's okay. You can lie to this infidel, steal. The God of the Bible says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So when we say it's one nation under God, it's more than just a nice little acknowledgement. That's the motivating factor that makes this whole self-government thing work. Right? And now, God knew that the children of Israel would break the law, and rather than them walking around with a continual guilty conscience, he had once a year the Day of Atonement when they would forgive all the sins for the whole nation. So you get a clean slate, right? And Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. I mean, in Islam, there's no Holy Spirit that says you can rape this woman, but don't rape that one. Right? It's the God that creates. It's our awareness of God that creates a conscience. Democrat candidate for president William Jennings Bryan says, a religion which teaches personal responsibility to God gives strength to morality. There is a powerful restraining influence in the belief that an all-seeing eye scrutinizes every thought and word and act of the individual. So what happens if you get rid of this God? Then you just got a bunch of rules that some men made up, right? Maybe some white men made up. And so why should we follow them? Well, some will out of social acceptance. Others are going to say, forget this. I'm just going to yield to my passions and my lusts. And they're going to start robbing and stealing and killing and smashing windows and setting buildings on fire and killing classmates. It's going to turn into chaos. And everybody's going to say, we need someone to come in from the government with enough power to restore order. And the government comes in and takes away everybody's guns and takes away your freedom of speech so you can't say something that offends somebody and causes them to riot. And they take away all this. Yeah, the government restores order, but when the dust settles, you will have transitioned from the people ruling themselves from the bottom up back to a king ruling from the top down. Even Plato says he says democracy won't last because people will give them a choice of keeping virtue or keeping their life. They'll always give up their virtue to save their life. So it's a matter of time that people are going to give up their virtue. It's going to turn into chaos and stealing and robbing. And out of that chaos, people are going to beg, panic-stricken, saying, we need somebody to hurry up and come in and restore order. And when they do, they usurp power. What happened to ancient Israel? The same thing. So Israel's system worked as long as the priests taught it to every brand new generation. Imagine if every computer you buy is preloaded with a virus. Right? You just buy it, you take it over to the Geek Squad desk. I just bought this. Can you clean the virus off? And so every kid is born preloaded with the virus of selfishness. And the Jews would take the kid to the Levite and say, recode this kid. The rabbi would sit the kid down and say, okay, kid, you want to steal, don't steal. You want to lie, don't lie. You want to commit adultery, don't commit adultery. God is watching you, going to hold you accountable. As long as the Levites taught it to every new generation, it kept going. But when the priests stopped teaching the law, what happened? I mean, here's Eli, the high priest, the main guy that's supposed to be teaching it. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then there's a Levite with a graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. You're reading the story, you think, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't it one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them? The Levites weren't following the law, much less teaching. And then a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite is to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with the woman not even married to. They're traveling. The house is surrounded by sodomites who are not just content doing their own stuff. They want to force it on them, and they end up raping the poor girl to death. And by the time you're grossed out, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priests had stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. So it turns into chaos. They all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, we want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And so what happens? They get a king, Saul, who turns around and kills most of the priests. You know the story. Saul is pouting that his son made friendship with David, and he says, nobody cares about me. And Doeg the Edomite says, King, I care about you. I saw David go to this town. The priests there gave him some bread. They even gave him the sword of Goliath. And Saul says, bring those priests here. When they come, he turns to his men and says, kill them. The men hesitate. Doeg the Edomite says, King, I'll kill them. Kills them all. What happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system where each person is individually accountable to God to follow the law. The law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn someone to death. There's only one, Doeg. And so they're hesitating. This does not compute. You're telling me to go against my conscience. I'm accountable to God. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. And so what we see is tyrants want to have kids being brought up where they do not have a standard of right and wrong. You want to teach them every single day. There's no right, there's no wrong. You can feel like a girl today, boy tomorrow. It's all fluid. And these kids are going to like, oh, everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Turns into chaos because some of the kids, it's right in my own eyes to kill you. How can it be wrong? You just told them that they're the standard of what's right and wrong. And so out of this chaos comes this beg for the government to come in with a strong leader. So again, democracy without virtue ends in chaos out of which a tyrant arises. So, I'm going to skip a story just for the sake of time. Word polis means city and like metropolis, and so politics is the business of the city. And so this is a story that it's interesting, but it's all in my books. So, am I out of time? How much time? I guess I'll keep talking until somebody pulls me. So, how did the church covenant turn into social contract, turn into socialism? So remember, covenant studied by these founders. John Robinson, the Pilgrim pastor. Pilgrims are knit together in a body as in covenant of the Lord to care for each other's good. John Winthrop, we are a company professing ourselves fellow members of Christ, knit together, entered into a covenant. We must be knit together, make one another's condition our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor, suffer together. We find the God of Israel is among us. So it's covenant. What's a covenant? It's people in agreement with each other, rights from God, accountable to God. All right, the ecclesia, the body. So we're in agreement with each other, rights from God, accountable to God. In the next century, covenant turned into social contract. It's people in agreement with each other, with or without God. If he's there, fine. If he's not, maybe he's distant. Well, next century, this turns into the French Revolution and Marxism. And it's social contract, people in agreement with each other, intentionally without God. And, they were turning churches into temples of reason in France during the French Revolution. And so what happens is, well, gee, you get rights from the group and you're accountable to the group. That makes the group God. The state becomes God. And whatever political boss is in charge of the state decides whose worth there is. And so in France, their French Revolution, they chopped off 40,000 heads in Paris. Here is Hegel, who brought this thought to Germany. He says, the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. Napoleon conquers Prussia, and afterwards this king decides he doesn't want to let that happen again. He needs to militarize Prussia, and so Hegel is his philosopher. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract. He says, when the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. This is what you have to look forward to with socialism without a creator. Hegel says, all the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. It's not you have a worth because you're made in the image of the creator. There is no creator. And so you have a communist leader in Cambodia, Pol Pot, kills a third of his country, millions of people. He says, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss, right? Because the state decides your worth. And the state says, well, you're not benefiting me, so you have no worth whatsoever. This is what happens when you get rid of a creator. And so Hegel says the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good or bad, like the Bible, like the Ten Commandments, these abstract rules of what's good or bad. No, it's just the state. It's just power. You serve the state, and as long as you do, you move up the ladder. You don't serve the state, it'll turn on you on a dime and throw you under the bus. Now, Hegel there's a group in the University of Berlin called the Young Hegelians, and one of the members was Karl Marx. And so Hegel influenced Marx, and then also Hegel influenced Hitler and Stalin. Hitler was what? The head of the National Socialist Workers' Party. Stalin was the head of what? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Even FDR said the Soviet Union is run by a dictatorship, as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. So in Venezuela, they voted in a socialist government, they got a dictator. Every socialist country winds up with a dictator. Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Mao Zedong. And the Communist Party members are the deep state. They're the ruling class. They're the new royalty. So you're back to a king and royalty, and then the people are the subjects. Eisenhower said this, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can, and inevitably will, take away those rights. Eisenhower goes on, the founding fathers had to refer to the creator in order to make their revolutionary experiment make sense. We had to claim we had rights from a power above the king's head. And the king was infringing on our God-given rights, and therefore we were obliged to rebel against the king. And so he goes on, it was because all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. And so we go through these 6,000 years. We see these pharaohs, Caesars, Kaisers, Sultans, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, and finally the king of England was most powerful. He was a globalist king. America's founders decided to break away from a king. We take the power of a king, break it into 3 branches. We separate it like the Tower of Babel, separated it federal state level. We tap this federal Frankenstein with 10 handcuffs. All the Constitution is, in a sense, is a bunch of hurdles to prevent the rubber band from snapping back and concentrating into the hands of a king. So who's the king in America? Here's the signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris. The magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Signer of the Constitution, John Jay, the people are the sovereign of this country. Another, James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. They have not parted with it. Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. Grover Cleveland, I love this quote, the sovereignty of 60 millions of free people is the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself, a manifestation of God's plan concerning the human race. So who's the king in America? We are. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-king. You know, I went out of the country and I'm coming back and you got to go through the passport. It says citizens, take this line. They should put up co-kings, take this line. We're co-kings of America. We're not subjects. Kings in Europe, they have subjects. You're subjected to their will. No, in America, we're co-kings. And here's James Wilson. Every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. Now, Romans 13 says, every person must be subject to the governing authorities. Well, who's the ultimate governing authority in America? We are, the people. The politicians are our servants. You hire them, you fire them. They're not your bosses. Now, imagine visiting a king, maybe in the Old Testament, and you're going through the streets of Jerusalem, and you're witnessing murder, rape, and crime. You finally get into the king's chamber. He's got his head in his hand. He's all worried. He looks up at you, and he says, did you see all that crime coming in here? I wish someone would fix it. You reach over, tap him on the shoulder, and say, excuse me, you're the king. This is your kingdom. I think you're the one accountable to God to fix this. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix it. Hello, have a finger reach through the TV tube and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. You're the one accountable to God to fix this mess. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, can somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do here? Hey, butler, come here. What am I supposed to do? No, it's your job to get educated on the issues, seek God's will, and you tell your representatives what needs to happen. You're the king. Chief Justice John Jay, Americans are the first people whom heaven has favored with an opportunity of choosing the forms of government under which they live. All other constitutions have derived their existence from violence or accidental circumstances. And this line, he says, your lives, your liberty, your property will be at the disposal only of your Creator and yourselves. This is what makes America great. This line right here. Your lives, your liberty, your property are at the disposal of you and your God. There's no king in between telling you, you got to live in this neighborhood, you're of that race, you got to live over there, you got to go to this church, or we'll burn you at the stake, you got to wear this dress, a burqa, or we'll rape you. No, it's you and your Creator. You decide what career you want to pursue, where you want to live, who you want to marry. You get to be the king of your life, and then together we're the king of the country. Reagan said it this way, in this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in the world's history. Every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. You get rid of a bad king, you got a good one, but then he has kids and you're rotten. They're rotten again. Here, he said, here, for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, how many thousand? Maybe 6,000? The Founding Fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. You get to determine what you want to do with your life. Our Founding Fathers, for all their human faults, they gave us a present, and the present is you get to be in charge of your life. Now, we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. A republic is where the people are king, ruling through representatives. So we're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. So when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in ruling myself. It's like, okay, dude, if you don't want to, somebody else will dictate to your life. So in America, you get to be the king of your life, and you have the opportunity of willingly submitting your life to Jesus, the King of Kings. Right? It says, thy people shall be willing in the day of his power. So we willingly have this opportunity to surrender ourselves to him. And Jesus Christ has made us kings and priests. So he's made us kings, and he's the King of Kings. So we cast our crowns at his feet. And now, who were the counselors to the king? 379 AD, the Roman Empire has become Christian. Constantine, now there's an emperor, Theodosius, and he's going to church in Milan. What would it be like being a pastor and having the emperor in your church? That'd be pretty cool. Well, that's exactly what we have in America. Pew Forum says 70% of Americans identify themselves as Christian, which means they go to church, which makes the pastors of America counselors to the king. Then there's two types of counselors. One tells the king to go to sleep, shirk your responsibility, don't get involved, just concentrate on your relationship with God, forget everything else. And another set of pastors throws ice water on his congregation and says, wake up. So remember the movie The Lord of the Rings? There's a scene of a King Theoden who has a spell cast on him. Gray hair, gray eyes, he's just out of it. And there's two counselors. One is this greasy counselor named Wormtongue who's whispering in the king's ear, saying, stay asleep, don't wake up, don't get involved, just let it all be fine, and soon it'll be over, all right? You'll be conquered. And then there's another counselor to the king named Gandalf, and he casts the devil out of the king. And right before your eyes, the king looks around, and his eyes become clear, and his hair gets short, and he wakes up, and he says, dark have been my dreams of late. It's like, yeah, you've been out of it with this spell cast on you. And he says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword. And so what it is America, the people are the king, and they've had a set of counselors telling them to just withdraw from the world, and then a bunch of other counselors are saying, look, you don't just have the right to vote in America, you're going to be held accountable to God for what happens. If they're teaching stuff to little kids that Jesus wouldn't teach, Jesus says, if you allow one of these little ones that believes in me to stumble, better that a millstone be put around your neck and thrown in the depths of the sea. And we, the people, are the king, we're letting this be taught to these little kids. Jesus was in Mary's womb from the moment of conception that the Holy Spirit came upon Mary. Life begins at conception. And if we're allowing them to kill babies in the womb, Jesus is going to hold you and I accountable. So the most important thing is to bring people to Christ, but the second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. Amen. And so, yes. So if you really believe the gospel is the answer, you will be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. You're going to be involved. Martin Luther King Jr. says the church is the conscience of the state. It's supposed to be addressing every issue. And I end with this thought. In times of crisis, people turn to Christ. How many of you turned to Christ when everything was perfect in your life? How many tend to pray and turn to the Lord when things are not going very good? Right? So we're wanting to have a revival. The revival may come on the heels of a national and maybe world crises. But it's also in times of crisis that leaders are raised up. Right? So someday you're going to be dead. It's a nice way to end a talk. And you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun, imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. It'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? You walk in the streets of gold. You meet Moses? Maybe Moses will invite you to his place. I don't know what it's like up there, but I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. Remember Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions, and I bet Moses will have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it? The burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs didn't fire. Anyway, I heard one preacher say, in heaven you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I said, I was thinking about something else. But imagine being there in Moses' living room. Maybe he's got a big one like here. And after the small talk's over, you say, Moses, he's sitting right in front of you, tap him and say, Moses, tell us, what was it like? I saw the movie. I read the book, but here you are. And Moses will stand up and he says, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, not only was he wanting to throw our babies in the river to kill them, now he's chasing us with his swords and his chariots, and we were totally unarmed. And I just stood there in faith, holding out my staff, and I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to look around the room and see David and say, hey, David, tell us your story. David will stand up, the room will get quiet. He'll say, I was just a teenager, and this thug giant Goliath was mocking our God and making fun of our faith, and these grown-ups were just too chicken to do anything. I said, enough of that. I went out there with my sling and hit him in the head and took his own sword and chopped his head off. One by one, they're all going to tell their exciting stories, and then everyone's going to look at you and say, you tell us your story. What was going on earth when it was your turn to be down there? What were they saying about the baby the Lord knew in the mother's womb, or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis? The man shall leave the father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one. What did you do when the whole world was against you? What did you do when people were saying bad things about you and posting bad things on the internet? What did you do when it looked like you were backstabbed by even your Christian friends? What are you going to say? But you're going to keep your eyes on Jesus. And you're going to hold that little thread, and it's going to just trust in him day by day and turn into a cord and a rope and a cable, and finally the presence of God comes back in your life. I'd hate for Jesus to walk into that Moses' living room scene and him have a big screen and show all kinds of great things happening and people turn to the Lord and just crowds and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do. But you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life and you look at that mountain that held you back from doing everything. It's just a little anthill. It's just a teeny little anthill. And you said, I let that fear of man, what other people say, hold me back from doing all this great stuff for the Lord. And you can't go back to earth to do anything else for him because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that try the soil. You still can do those things that you will be known for forever. This is the greatest time to be alive. Out of the 6,000 years of world history, God decided you would be alive right now. He knows every wicked plan of the enemy, and he thinks you've got what it takes. Right? It's like a basketball coach says, okay, you're on the bench. It's time for you to get in the game. But coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know. It's your turn. Get in the game. But coach, look, somebody just got knocked down. So yeah, I know, you're 7 feet tall. They are 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. This is your time. God bless you. Thank you so much.